Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Kirsten Wiley, and I'm here today to introduce and welcome John Tierney and Roy Baumeister, who are visiting us as part of the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. John and Roy are here today to discuss their book, Willpower, Rediscovering the Greatest Human Strength. You may have noticed that eating and sleeping, or lack thereof, have dramatic effects on your willpower and your self-control. With the right tools, willpower can be built and conserved for crucial moments. Roy received his PhD from Princeton and is the head of social psychology at Florida State University. This year he will receive the Jack Block Award for Distinguished Contributions to Personality Psychology. Willpower is his 28th book. John Tierney writes the Findings Science column for the New York Times. His science writing has won awards, and he is a frequent guest on national radio and television programs. He is the author of the Best Case Scenario Handbook and co-author of the comic novel God is My Broker. Please join me in welcoming them to Microsoft. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm John. This is Roy, and in a minute I'm going to ask Roy about his research. First, I just wanted to give a brief introduction here and to thank all of you for coming here during your lunch hour. It takes willpower to come to a talk about willpower. I don't think Charlie Sheen spends his lunch hours doing this. It's just my guess. But even though all of you obviously possess this virtue, I would bet that most of you think that you don't have enough. If you ask people to name their greatest strengths, they'll often credit themselves with honesty, with kindness, humor, creativity, bravery. And researchers have done this to more than 1 million people around the world. But they'll credit themselves even with modesty, but not with self-control. It came in dead last among the virtues that were studied in this survey. And of the 24 character strengths, self-control was the one that people were least likely to recognize in themselves. And conversely, if you ask people about their failings in this survey, a lack of self-control is at the top of the list. Now, I understand this feeling completely. I am a lifelong procrastinator. In college, I spent my summers working on overdue term papers, and in 2 decades of writing columns for magazines and newspapers, I never turned one in early. I know it's probably hard for you to believe in the software business that anyone doesn't meet a deadline, but it actually happens in journalism sometimes. But the amazing thing to me about this project with Roy is that we turned in this manuscript 2 months ahead of time. And I'm afraid that the Authors Guild is going to throw us out for doing that. Now, I give full credit to Roy and his research and the strategies that we drew from this. He's found that it's possible to build willpower, and that building willpower is more important today than ever. We think it's psychology's best hope for improving people's lives and for creating a better society. The more the researchers study willpower, the more central it becomes in understanding why some people thrive and why some people don't. However you define success, a happy family, good friends, a satisfying career, robust health, financial security, the freedom to pursue your passions, it tends to be accompanied by 2 qualities. When psychologists isolate the factors that predict positive outcomes in life, they consistently find 2 traits: intelligence and self-control. Now, so far, they still haven't figured out much to do with intelligence, but they have discovered, or at least rediscovered, how to improve self-control. And I say rediscovered because our ancestors made some pretty shrewd guesses about this. And in the Victorian era, that's where our notion of willpower as a muscle comes from. But then during the 20th century, a lot of this sense was lost. People began to doubt that willpower existed, that there was even such a thing as free will, and it became unfashionable both in academia and in the popular culture to promote this old Victorian idea of willpower. And I discovered this a few years ago myself. I was having dinner with a friend, a fellow writer, Chris Buckley, and the comic novelist, and we were talking about the thing that serious writers always talk about when they get together, which is money, and why we needed more of it. And we were bemoaning the fact that the bestseller list, there were all these spiritual and financial get-rich-quick books, these self-help books, were all at the top of the bestseller list. And so we thought, why don't we try to write one and we'll combine them both. It'll be spiritual self-help and financial self-help. And we called it God is My Broker. The subtitle was A Monk Tycoon Reveals the 7.5 Laws of Spiritual and Financial Growth. And it's about this monastery that becomes fabulously rich and corrupt. They spend a fortune renovating the place. They bring in an interior decorator from downtown Manhattan who explains the look he's after to the monks. He says, we want it to say poverty, but we don't want it to say cheap. And then along the way, they discover the 7.5 laws of spiritual and financial growth, such as God loves the poor, but that doesn't mean you have to fly coach. Or another law is simply, money is God's way of saying thanks. And my favorite law is, as long as God knows the truth, it doesn't matter what you tell your customers. Now, while writing this spoof of self-help books, I had to go back and read the sort of the history of this genre. And I noticed this weird sort of backward evolution, it seemed to me. If you went back to the 19th century, there was this huge international bestseller called Self-Help by an Englishman. And he taught the lesson that genius is patience and persistence explains success. Ben Franklin has said the same thing. But then in the 20th century, you got into all these self-help books promoting very quick and easy ways to success. How to win friends and influence people, the power of positive thinking. There was a new slogan, believe it, achieve it. Now, as I read them, I kept wondering, what's gone wrong? Why do the old ones seem more useful than the new ones? And I didn't really quite know what to make of this in the social sciences until I started writing a science column for the New York Times, and I had a lucky break. I went to the big meeting for social psychologists, which that year was in Memphis. And it occurred to me going to this meeting, it would be fun to go out and have a social psychologist analyze the people going to Graceland. And I asked Ben Carey, who covers social sciences for the Times, who would you suggest, who might be fun to go to Graceland with? And he was kind of, Graceland? You really would need somebody with a very interesting mind for that. And then he paused for about a second and goes, Roy Baumeister is your man. So now Roy and I never actually got to Graceland that year. We were too busy doing other stuff. But we did start talking, and I discovered that he had gone on his own evolution in thinking about self-control and willpower. When he started his career in the 1970s at Princeton, psychologists were focusing not so much on self-control but on self-esteem, and Roy was an early leader in that research. And that did show that people with more self-esteem tended to be more successful. But then Roy and others found out that that's not the causative link, that it turns out that self-esteem didn't lead to success, rather that success leads to self-esteem. And then Roy noticed something that did lead to success, self-control. He developed a scale and personality test for measuring self-control, and it turned out that this was the only personality trait of the dozen studied that predicted a college student's grade point average better than chance. Self-control also proved to be a better predictor of college grades than the student's IQ or SAT score. So Roy began trying to understand the mysteries of self-control. And I'll ask Roy to tell you what he found in the lab.
All right, well, one thing we found, was that self-control seems to operate like a muscle. For one thing, it gets tired when you use it. So we think of it as a stable aspect of character, that you have more or less self-control. But no, the amount you have fluctuates, just like your muscular strength. And it's a muscle that you're using all the time, all day. We've just finished a study where people wore beepers, and we tracked them around during the day, and they reported on were they being tempted or wanting this or that, and are they acting on it, and so on. And yes, it does. It does fluctuate, and indeed what seemed to happen and what we found over and over in our first set of lab studies was that after exerting self-control on one thing, if you go on to another demand for self-control, you'll be less effective of it, just like a muscle gets tired. And so this happens over and over across the course of the day. Other things we found, perhaps more recently, is that's well, first of all, to pursue the muscle analogy, yes, it gets tired when you use it, but as you exercise it, it gets stronger over time. And so, as John suggested there, intelligence and self-control are the two traits psychology knows that really predict success across a broad range of spheres. But we haven't been able to produce lasting increases in intelligence. Self-control, however, you can produce improvements, even in adulthood, by exercising it regularly. So that's one great way for psychology to produce benefits to people through society. Also, when you see these drop off, it's not that it doesn't take that the muscle is completely exhausted. Like an athlete playing a big game, when you start to get a little bit tired, you automatically start conserving your remaining energy. So even just a few minutes of self-control are enough to produce a little bit of a decrement in subsequent performance. One of our early studies that caught people's attention was we had people skip a meal before, and in psychology you always have to tell them you're studying one thing and then study something else, because if you tell them exactly what they're studying, then they get kind of weird about that. So we told them it was an experiment on their memory for taste. They came to the experiment having skipped lunch or not eaten for 3 or 4 hours. So basically they're hungry. And then we set up a Microsoft oven in the laboratory, baked chocolate chip cookies there, and you know how that blows out the smell. So the laboratory just smelled this wonderful smell of freshly baked chocolate. So they come in, they're hungry, they smell this delicious smell, and then we see them at a table. There's a stack of these cookies and chocolates and all these other things. Also on the table there's a bowl of radishes, and the one condition of the experiment, we tell them, well, you've been assigned to the radish condition. So your task is going to be to eat radishes and taste them and basically keep your hands off the chocolates there for other people in the experiment. And then we left them alone for a few minutes to maximize the temptation. And of course we didn't trust them, so we secretly observed them to see what they did. And yeah, they were tempted, lots of longing glances toward the chocolate. People would pick them up and sniff them and put them back. People drop them on the floor and put them back. But nobody bit into the forbidden food, and they all managed to eat a radish or two. And then we had a couple other conditions in the experiment, one where they ate the chocolates, not the radishes, and one where there was no food at all. But the ones we were interested in are the ones who had to sit there smelling those chocolates and seeing those chocolates and wanting those chocolates and cookies, but instead having to make themselves eat those stupid old radishes. And then, borrowing a procedure from stress research, we took them to a different room, and gave them difficult, actually unsolvable puzzles, because you see how long do they keep trying and keep going before they give up. And it turns out 5 minutes of resisting the temptation of the cookies took 10 minutes off how long they would persevere and keep trying. They were much easier just to give up on the difficult puzzles, simply because they'd exerted a little bit of self-control. By no means were they exhausted. But again, like a muscle that starts to get tired, you start to conserve it. So that's one point, that it works like a muscle. Now, another thing that we've discovered more recently is that other things beyond self-control use it. And this may be particularly interesting to this group. We're finding ties to creativity, to decision-making, to even intelligent thought. We have people take intelligence tests. As you probably know, there are a couple kinds of thinking. The cognitive psychologists distinguish basically between the automatic and the controlled. So in terms of IQ tests, there'll be questions where you have to figure out a reasoning problem, and there'll be other items like they ask you basic questions like how many people in the Senate, or give them a vocabulary test. And you think, well, what does vocabulary have to do? It's not hard to know a vocabulary word. Just knowing what dilatory means, does that mean you're smarter? But in fact, smart people know more words than dumb people, so it works as a valid test. Now, what happens if you've exerted self-control, say you resist temptation for radishes, or we have all sorts of procedures. You watch a funny movie and you try not to laugh at it, or you squeeze a hand grip, or any kind of exerting control over your behavior. And then we go in, after that's done, take an IQ test. Their vocabulary is intact. All the automatic thinking is intact, but on their reasoning, on their ability to think in a fluid, intelligent, logical way, that's significantly compromised, and even by a fairly small amount. So there may be, understanding that these things are tied together, how smart you are will fluctuate too as a function of how much willpower that you have. Then we found making decisions, making choices, also depletes the same resource. In one study, we had people look at consumer products, either in control condition, they just rated how much have you used this product in the last 6 months, and does it look good to you, and a few things like that. In the crucial condition, however, we gave them 2 at a time and said, which one would you rather have, a red T-shirt or a blue T-shirt, vanilla-scented candle or an almond-scented candle. We make a bunch of these choices. And then we gave them one of the classic tests of self-control, which is how long can you hold your hand in ice water. There's 1 degree, 33 or 34 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's unpleasant, and your hand wants to pull out, and so you have to use self-control to do it. And their persistence in holding their hand in water dropped by half as a result of making choices as opposed to looking at all the same products and thinking about the same products. So making decisions will use up that same. And, sometimes I think people have an intuitive sense that you have a limited amount of self-control and you resist temptations, and maybe you get fried, or maybe you study and you get tired or something. But they don't seem to have any idea intuitively that making choices and making decisions is going to deplete and interfere with their willpower. And it sort of sheds a new light on all these political scandals where you see people say, well, how could they throw away their career, as an important politician with a great leadership role in society or in the world? How could they jeopardize it on, tweeting pictures of their genitals or whatever? Well, you have to understand, though, that making decisions is going to use up their willpower, and so there will be moments when their self-control is lower than it normally is. It's not that we somehow elect all these degenerates to office, but maybe we do, but in general, these are perhaps ordinary people, and not particularly better or worse than anybody else. But yes, their self-control will be depleted. There was a study that came out just while we were finishing the book on judges making parole decisions, and the easy thing for the judge to do is just to send him back to prison, because there's a risk for the judge if he releases the convict out and he commits another crime. It reflects badly on the judge. And you're looking at the odds of the guy getting parole. Well, if he comes up to the parole board when the judges are fresh early in the morning and rested and so on, they have a pretty good chance of getting parole. But as the day wears on and the judges get tired making one decision after another, they're more likely to say, just send him back to the slammer. And huge drops in the likelihood, and it's just the luck of the draw of when you come up there. So understand that all these things are tied in together. And then by accident we discovered too that this is not just a metaphor. This energy that you use, this strength that you have, it's really tied into the basic body's energy. We were doing an experiment where people sometimes ask, well, if resisting temptation depletes your willpower, does giving in to temptation, will this make you stronger? And we thought, well, this is a very appealing theory. We call it the Mardi Gras theory because, like you go to Mardi Gras and get ready for Lent. I said, well, this would be cool if it worked. And the grad student brought it, and I said, well, I don't really see how that would work, but go ahead and try it. And so he tried it, and he had people first exert self-control and then give them a second task unrelated to it. And in between, some of them were given a nice dish of ice cream to eat. And we thought, well, we get to indulge, and will this improve? And it actually did improve their self-control afterwards. The catch, though, is that one of the control conditions, we gave them something else to eat that didn't taste good at all. It was, instead of ice cream, it was a milkshake mixed with half and half. So it was this large blob of yuck dairy, milky stuff. And people didn't like it. They rated it worse than the other control condition where they're sitting around reading out-of-date technical magazines. So they didn't like that. But that also improved their self-control. So my grad student came into my office and said, no, the study didn't work. It was a control condition, messed it up. And I said, well, wait a minute, something's happening here. And we started to think, it looked like eating really restored their energy and their ability to exert self-control. As I said, we talked about this as a metaphor, but then could it really just be energy in the basic biological sense? This is the calories that your body uses. So we start reading up about these things, and we learned about glucose, which is a chemical in your bloodstream that takes the energy from the food you take in and carries it around to your muscles and to your organs, and also to your brain. I mean, the neurotransmitters that allow the brain cells to work and fire and communicate with each other, these are made from glucose. So we learned about glucose, and a nutritionist had collected all kinds of data without much of a theory or plan, and showing, yes, there are all kinds of effects that really look like self-control deficits when people, either experimentally or through health problems or whatever, have disruptions in glucose. They found things like there's studies of juvenile delinquents who'd just been arrested, and their glucose was exceptionally low. And well, I think maybe their glucose happened to be low. That's why they had a lapse in self-control and committed some crime and got caught, and that's why they got into trouble. Or there are nicely controlled studies with children and having breakfast, where they tell the whole class, nobody eat breakfast, and they come in and randomly assign half the kids to get breakfast and the other half not. Well, the ones who got breakfast, then they learn more and they behave better than the others. And then at 10:30, when everybody gets a snack, then the differences disappear. And there are all sorts of other things tied into diabetes and other sorts of things looking at glucose. So we started doing lab studies, and yeah, the glucose in your bloodstream seems, first of all, exerting self-control, produced drops in the blood glucose. Things like, we had people talk about affirmative action and racial profiling, which are sensitive topics, either with a member of their own race or a member of a different race. Because talking about these topics with a member of another race, studies show that uses self-control. It's kind of sensitive. You got to watch what you say and worry about giving offense. Well, talking about them with someone your own race, your glucose is the same after as before. But talking about them with somebody of a different race, glucose was significantly lower afterwards. So something was going on. The brain was working a lot harder, using up a lot more of the fuel, exerting self-control to make sure you just didn't say the wrong thing. And then glucose levels predicted self-control performance. And then we tried manipulating things. We have one manipulation where we give people a glass of lemonade, either diet or regular. We mix it either with sugar or Splenda. You can do it in a nice double blind, so the person comes in and the experimenter doesn't know what's in the lemonade and the subject doesn't know either. They just get a glass of lemonade, and it's very nice. We were in the South, and it's hot, and people are glad, and they suck it right down, and it tastes perfectly well either way. But the one gives you a big replenishment of glucose, and the other doesn't. And then we deplete their energy and then give them a test of self-control. Well, the ones who got sugar, they're suddenly doing well again. The ones who got Splenda in their lemonade, they're still doing badly. Now, I'm not unmindful of the irony of giving people sugar to improve their self-control, because most people want to use self-control to resist sugar. So I say, don't try this at home. It actually will work just fine with other kinds of food, lean protein or whatever, lean meat. But we use sugar in the laboratory because it's fast-acting, and you only have people for a short time in the laboratory. But yes, it seems that keeping your glucose up will help compensate after you've made a lot of choices or exerted self-control, and so your performance would tend to slip. You can improve it so much. And going back to that study with the judges, they found that if you come up for parole just before lunch, your chances were I think, 15%. That's what, 1 out of 6 or 7. Whereas right after lunch, next in the queue, right after lunch, it's 2/3 of them got parole. It's just somehow the judges got their glucose restored, and suddenly were willing to think harder and take a look, and basically the same resume in terms of record in prison and the crime and everything, but just they're much more willing to take a chance and do the more difficult thing.
That's a great case for having the cobbler out here. Yes. In fact, I had some right before we came in, but there are lots of other strategies that don't involve quick intake of sugar. For dealing with self-control, and we talk about these in the book. It's based on studies that Roy has done. Some of them are involved. One of the really surprising studies was when they sent college students. They did a self-control test in the lab, and then Roy sent them home for the week and said, just sit up straight, practice sitting up straight. Whenever you think of it, work on your posture. And they would come back a week later, and their self-control improved not just in their posture, but in all these other things. They had strengthened that muscle.
Yeah, that's a key point, John. Yeah. That it's one resource and it's used for everything. So any kind of exercise you do will improve it for anything else. And our lab has found that, and other labs have found that too. That working on one thing, so you work on your posture, and yeah, your posture will be better after a while. But it's not just that; it improves your capacity to change yourself. It makes you a stronger person. And so on lab tests that have nothing to do with posture, you do better.
And we talk about other strategies, and Roy's done lots of other experiments, but we've been talking for a while, and I think we'd be glad to take questions from folks about the research or about strategies or anything that you'd like. Any questions about willpower or self-control or how to get software projects done on time?
Yes.
You mentioned that reasoning and problem-solving puzzles and stuff would drain someone's ability to exercise self-control. Does that also help them develop their self-control? Or
yes.
Is it just the
yes. Again, it's just like a muscle. The short-term effect is it will get tired and do worse. So you're spending a hard day thinking really hard. Well, maybe that night you go home, you'll be a little more crabby with your partner, or a little more likely to eat all the M&Ms or something like that. But as you do this over and over again, in the long run, you will get stronger and improve your capability at it. Yes.
are all forms of self-control against all impulses the same, or does it vary by the type of impulse, whether it's you're trying to control aggression versus trying to stay awake?
It's the same capacity for control. Different people have different impulses. I mean, one of the puzzlers. Let me just grab the water here. One of the puzzlers is in self-control is gender differences. As you may know, Sigmund Freud said he thought the superego derives from castration anxiety, and he said, well, women don't have a penis, so their self-control is going to be weaker. They'll have a less of a... But, all the data show that women are less likely to do all the self-control problems, less likely to get into fights or sexual misdeeds and drugs and stuff like that. So which way does it go? But on the gender-neutral tests, it looks like men and women do about the same. The difference is men and women have about the same capacity for self-control, but men, and especially like adolescent boys and so on, have stronger impulses for a lot of these things, and so the control is worse. By the same token, moving from childhood into adolescence, the problem is they've learned to control themselves to a certain level as children, and they take that same self-control, and suddenly their impulses are a lot stronger. So the behavior gets a lot worse, which is why people occasionally complain about teenagers. But they're operating with a child's amount of self-control on an adult's kind of impulses. So the impulses vary in strength, but it is the one capacity that you're using for all different things. Yes?
Most of the studies you're describing have been around individuals and willpower. Is there any research on groups and the impact of groups, either for or against willpower, the willpower of groups, or is it?
No, there is not. In terms of groups, now there is stuff about people can work together and can influence each other. Indeed, other than pure willpower, there are other things you can do to improve self-control, and social pressure is a good one. So. It's just as a simple example, people try to quit smoking. If they decide themselves, I'm going to quit smoking and don't tell anybody, well, they can be a little bit successful. They tell all their friends they're going to quit smoking. They might do a little bit better because it's more of an embarrassment and things like that. So social factors play into it. Indeed, there's evidence people quitting smoking is contagious. People do it when their friends and neighbors and so on do it. Obesity and dieting, the same sorts of things people gain and lose in groups. So there are social influences there. But say your basic idea that does one football team have better willpower than another football team, I don't know of any kind of research on that. That'd be an interesting thing to look at.
Yeah, most of your examples about willpower seem to be around kind of self-restraint. Isn't there a form of willpower that's more commitment-oriented, whereas a more positive?
Yeah, this is a good point. Restraint is what people tend to think of, but self-control, for which willpower is one of the key tools, is just a matter of altering yourself. In the research, they often use the term self-regulation, and I like the term regulation because it means change, but not just any change. It means change toward a particular idea. So when the government has regulations for how to make buildings or how to make sausages or whatever, it doesn't just say do them differently. It says they have to be made in this certain manner with these ingredients, or windows in every room or whatever regulations they make. And so you're changing yourself. When I first surveyed the literature on self-control, there were four main domains. There's controlling your thoughts. That's like trying to concentrate, trying to reach a certain conclusion, trying to shut that annoying song out of your mind, trying to forget about your stupid ex-boyfriend or girlfriend, all those things. Controlling your emotions, as in, well, that can be either increasing or decreasing an emotion or prolonging an emotion. Sometimes you try to stay angry long enough to make your case when you have to wait your turn to complain. Waiting in line for the cable company to get you, sort of trying to sustain your indignation. Anyway, any sort of regulating of your emotional state. Then there's impulse control, which can be, it's mostly restraining, but it could be, use self-control to drag yourself out of bed in the morning. There's a positive thing, or another military thing to get yourself to walk toward people who are shooting at you. That is not natural. And so it takes a fair amount of self-control to do it. So that's the third. And last would be performance regulation. So you try not to choke under pressure, try to do your best, try to persist in the face of failure, speed accuracy trade-offs, and so on. There might be a couple other things, like managing your life and figuring out how to, but those are the main four: thoughts, feelings, impulses, and performance. And again, it's one stock of willpower that applies to all of them. Now, that doesn't mean that people are equally good at all of them. You have a limited resource, and so people budget it. So some people get all their work done on time, but have trouble finding time to get a haircut or something like that. Indeed, one of the early studies, they were trying to develop a scale for this. And he said, well, he was developing it with Stanford students, and he said, okay, what will a student with good self-control do? He'll turn in all his assignments on time. He'll change his socks every day, and made all these other lists. And they made this questionnaire, gave it to all the students at Stanford. Well, getting your work done on time and changing your socks every day were correlated minus 0.6. Apparently, they could do one or the other. Researchers said,
especially during exam time.
Yeah, especially during exam time. There's some other recent papers that students during exam time, everything else goes to hell because they're using their willpower to try complete the work that they should have been doing all semester, or just try to maximize their performance and concentrate. And so they stop washing their hair, they go back to smoking more, they start eating badly, their emotional control gets down, they get crabby and anxious and all these things. So there's a sort of whole general degeneration of behavior in students around exam time, but it's because you have a limited resource. So it's like I said, it is one thing that's used for all the different ones, but a limited resource, so you budget it and you put it on what's important.
One of the big strategies is not, we've talked about building this willpower muscle and doing these exercises, but some of Roy's most interesting recent research has shown that paradoxically the people who score highest in self-control actually use it less during the day. And these are studies following people when they're exerting it. And that's because people use their self-control not to just resist one temptation after another, but they set up their lives so that they don't have to use that. They don't walk by the bakery. They don't put things off to the last minute. They don't go to all-you-can-eat buffets. And that way they conserve their willpower so they have it when the emergencies come up. And so they rely on habits instead of these conscious decisions and efforts of will. It's much easier to schedule a workout with a friend 3 days a week instead of trying to decide every day whether to make yourself exercise or not. And
John, that's willpower too. It's just you're using it to control your habits. Right. And that seems to be the more important and productive way to use it. You think of willpower as Ulysses on the deck. You're resisting the siren's call and debating whether to steer his ship onto the rocks or pull away or not. But actually, the person with good self-control went home by a different route and didn't get exposed to the temptation, and that's it. In this beeper study that I mentioned where people wore beepers, we thought, okay, people with high self-control will just resist more temptations because we record how often do they resist a temptation. But they actually resisted less. But we also found that they were much less likely to be exposed to problematic sorts of desires. So again, creating good habits. Willpower, people think of it for dieting, that's everybody's favorite example, but there's just a huge meta-analysis that combined a large number of studies. And trait self-control helps a little bit with dieting and stuff like that, but has much bigger effects on work and school performance, because that's something where setting up good habits is something that people can do. So you're using your willpower for that. We call it in the book playing offense rather than defense. Wait till you're in a crisis and use your willpower to bail yourself out. Instead, use it to set life up so that you don't have as many crises.
Right. And something else to do, people tend to equate, and researchers have also done this too, the first thing you think about when the subject of self-control or willpower comes up is dieting. And yet that is really one of the least things correlating with willpower. The self-control and willpower do not correlate that well with ability to lose weight. And that's because dieting is such a singularly hard thing to do, and part of it is this glucose connection that you need, that there's this catch-22 that in order to diet, you need willpower. In order to have willpower, you need to eat. So there's this contradiction. And that's why you have people who have phenomenally good self-control and everything else have a hard time losing weight. It's the stereotype people think of using self-control, but it's actually kind of the least representative example of how you use it in your life.
described so far, it seems like it's very difficult to separate will control from just energy level. When you talk about it as willpower is something tangible, like there's a brain center that operates on it. But in all of these experiments, could you just replace physical exercise or some other form of fatigue? Would it also influence the willpower afterwards? I mean, how do you actually separate willpower from any other kind of fatigue? I mean, exerting willpower from any other kind of just getting tired.
Oh, okay, well, willpower is separating willpower from being tired. You mean separating the low willpower problems from that?
It sounds like you're talking about the resource and you deplete it.
Yeah.
It could be just overall level of energy that you are depleting.
Yeah, well, there's some connection to it. Now, you can have a lot of energy and have poor self-control. That's sort of the stereotype of the kids with attention deficit disorders. They're bouncing off the walls and so on. So energy alone is is not enough. Now, in terms of low energy, well, the results aren't as clear on this. You know, you think that just being physically tired should impair everything else, and there are some connections like that, but it isn't as simple. Also, the depletion effects, where the self-control starts to go bad, that happens long before people feel physically tired. So I don't know yet all the tie-ins there, and our lab and other labs are working on these tie-ins. There are things like heart rate variability is connected to self-control, that having a more variable heart rate seems to be associated with good self-control, and that when the heart rate gets more uniform for some reason, that, and so we don't know exactly how that works, but that's an important thing too. There are other tie-ins. So I would say when you're using up a lot of your physical energy, yes, that's probably going to take away from willpower, but you will see willpower changes and self-control changes long before you have any sense of physical exhaustion or exertion. Let me mention one more thing. The immune system is a highly variable, but sometimes a very intense user of glucose. So when you're fighting off a cold, those findings that say when you have a cold, it's driving there is worse than driving drunk in terms of your impairment. Well, that's a sign, and self-control is impaired then too. So we've gotten to was in the laboratory. One sign that somebody might be starting to get sick is that their self-control breaks down. They seem to get more irritable, more bothered by things, and that's long before they have any other symptom, any feeling of being bad. But it does go, what happens when you do really start to get sick? The people who fight it off are the ones who just stop doing everything and go and sleep, because that allows your body to take all its energy and put it into fighting off the disease, and that you can bounce back and be healthy. You think, I got to go to this meeting and finish this thing, but it's often more efficient in the long run just to take the day off, sleep it away, and allow the immune system to work, and then you get back there, because that is, again, it's the same basic glucose that you use for all these things that's used for disease.
How about just reading before the test rather than being tempted and forced to self-control?
Did you say reading or eating?
Reading, just some kind of mental effort that should spend some of your.
Well, there are various experiments
for
decision fatigue where they would have people go. I mean, Roy talked about some of them, and there were other ones where they had to go through the process. They were choosing a computer to buy, and they would go through all the process of reading about them and doing it. But the people who actually had to choose exactly which feature, they showed a depletion, whereas the other ones didn't. And there's been another thing where researchers have spent a lot of time trying to figure out what are the physical symptoms of ego depletion. How do you know when you're and it's been surprisingly difficult. There isn't one simple thing you feel the way you feel when you're tired. You know you're tired, but ego depletion doesn't manifest itself in any one thing. It's more that things in general seem to affect you more. Good things seem better. Bad things are more irritating. But it isn't a very sharp symptom that way.
Yeah. Reading's an interesting one because it takes some degree of controlling your attention. It's one of the arguments why it was better for kids to read books than watch TV and so on. But it's certainly not as strenuous as, say, doing math in your head or something like that. So I would guess that you'd have a little bit of use of willpower and glucose and energy for just reading. And it depends, too, on what you're reading. Do you have to force yourself to keep doing it? Say, reading Kant or reading your statistics book is probably going to deplete your energy. Reading something that's fun to read probably would be much less depleting. Yes.
And so along those lines, when you're, I guess, passionate about something or interested in something, maybe like reading comic books, it's up with less self-control. So did you find it all in your studies? You said earlier that the two factors that determine a successful person are intelligence and self-control. Is like passion or interest not a factor?
Well, yeah. When I said the two traits, these passion would be tied to some specific thing. So yes, being passionate, being motivated will help you do whatever it does. But being passionate at one thing doesn't necessarily generalize to everything else. So what I meant by that, they've looked at intelligence in every occupation that's been studied. Smart people do better than dumb people. Not just software engineers, but janitors and waiters and waitresses and so on. The intelligent ones do better than the other. It's remarkable. And self-control, not as much data, but it's looking like the same thing. So yes, and I would say passion is not a trait that you carry around independent of what you're doing, but passion be more specific. But yeah, that certainly, I would think that'd be a plus.
Given that self-control is it seems it's affected by social environmental variables, is there a way that you can maybe borrow self-control from others around you? Or
outsource it. We talk in the book about this, about outsourcing self-control. And really 12-step groups do that. You go there. And one of the points, we've got a chapter dealing with the quantified self movement that you probably are familiar with here, but there are all these new digital tools for monitoring. The basic steps in self-control are to set realistic goals and to monitor yourself. And we all make this, it's called the planning fallacy, that we all tend to think we'll get more done. And we talk in the book about how do you set long-term goals or short-term goals. But monitoring is a huge part of that, and that's where you can rely on groups to do it for you, and you can rely on software to do it for you. I have rescue time monitoring my computer to tell me so I can see how much time I spent on Microsoft Word, which is productive, and how much time I'm surfing the web. And I use mint.com to track my money for me, and all these things that that help you. You're basically outsourcing it to other people. And that's one of the reasons that studies have consistently shown that religious people have more self-control. Now, some of that's probably because religions have some of these exercises, the equivalent of sitting up straight, that you do these prayers and meditations, and that builds your self-control. But some of it also is that you're part of this group, this congregation that is watching you, and that you know that they're going to see you do something wrong. So you've basically outsourced that self-control to someone else. And I think one of the great things about social media now and all these new digital tools is that you can do it. There are websites like stick.com where you can make a bet and appoint a referee, and everybody's watching you. And then there's a software I'm sure you guys know about, where they'll email your boss or your spouse which websites you visited, and so that's really outsourcing.
Are there any correlations between ADHD and self-control?
Oh yes, that's not my specialty area, but some of the top people, Berkeley, specifically treat ADHD as a deficit in self-control and see that as the core aspect of it, the core manifestation. So yes, absolutely.
So it seems like you're touching on what I was about to get into, and that would be monitoring. It seems to me that you could remember states in which you made good decisions, and you could kind of observe how you felt, kind of make a trial balloon decision currently and make comparisons and get a feel for what kind of state you're in at any time.
Remembering why things went, when things went right. And one of the great things about monitoring is simply being able to watch yourself over time and see what correlates with what. It gives you the sense, and one of the ways around the planning fallacy, it's amazing, there have been these experiments when they ask students to predict how long it'll take them to do a term paper. And everybody expects to get it done too soon, basically. Very few people even meet their worst case deadlines.
That's right. Yeah.
And you'd think, and I've been a journalist, all my life, and you'd think I would know by this time how long it takes me to write a column. And yet I'm still always telling myself, I'll get that done in the morning. And what I found writing this book, what I did, I mean, I did a few things. I had rescue time, but the simplest thing I did was I just made myself write down at the end of the day, how many words did you write that day? So that helped restrain my procrastinating, because I knew, that I could go research a topic for 2 hours and might be fun, but it wasn't going to add to that total. So I knew I had to do that. But the other thing was, it was just good to be able to look at the end of the week. I never got done as much as I wanted to, but I could see how much I'd gotten done, and I gradually became a little more realistic when I'd say, okay, we've gotten 30,000 words done, and I'm hoping by the end of this month I'll have this much done. But I was getting more realistic. I wouldn't tell myself, oh, you're going to write 3,000 words a day this week. I could look back and see, you've never done that before. Why would you do it now? So.
As you were talking about IQ, sort of an analogy, and muscles, I started thinking, is the goal to turn ourselves into like hulking superheroes of self-control? And then the reason why I asked that is because I was thinking about my artist friends who are frankly pretty reckless at times. They just abandon, it seems like, their self-control. And they use that time to incubate the ideas and create. And I'm wondering if there's a danger of, like, perpetuating almost...
there's a good line about that. In the book, Ron and I visited David Allen of the Getting Things Done, GTD, if you know, it was really fun visiting him. And he has a nice line about it, because he works with a lot of artists. The Simpsons writers use GTD. I mean, he got me using GTD. I use it now. I use Remember the Milk. And his line about artists was, what he tells them is, that your mind can only handle one mess at a time, and he said that if you're trying to find God and you have to get dog food, your mind's gonna be thinking about dog food. So get rid of the dog food, get that, so your mind is free to create. And I think that's really true. I mean, Drew Carey, we profile him. He's someone that David Allen worked with, and he had enough money. He hired David Allen to just come and sit next to him and go through his inbox with them and say, what do I do with this email? What with that? And Carey just said he found it amazingly liberating, that he could actually go read a book or go to a yoga class or work on a comedy routine without thinking there's 12 other things I ought to be doing. So that was...
Yes?
Just thinking about the combination that you mentioned at the beginning of success being intelligence and willpower, and many of us have little children, and wondering what you might recommend we do to, teach them that willpower at a young age, so to essentially set them up for success later.
There's a fairly long chapter in the book about this, because we realized the importance of it. And as I said, I started off in the self-esteem movement, and our society is very much with was afraid to criticize children and so on, because it'll damage their self-esteem. But they have great self-esteem. Unless you're constantly negative to the point of abusive, you don't have to worry about their self-esteem. Make self-control the priority, and just having that in your mind already as a parent, that gets you far. With ours, my wife started that when she was still nursing, she would ask the baby to stop crying before she got fed. And so the baby learned really good emotion control. So she learned, and you had to really sit there and wait, come on, stop crying. And as soon as she got herself to stop crying, she got a hold of her feelings, then immediately she got the breast. And so instead of learning to just cry and go nuts, and that the only way you get what you want is to have a tantrum, you learn to control the tantrum. There was this book, The Tiger Mom Confessions and so on. And for many Americans, that's extreme, but you can't argue with results. The Asian subpopulation, they overachieve relative to IQ compared to white people at all multiple measures and levels throughout society. So some of the things they do, just insisting that the children have rules, and with the small child, simple rules, and then with the older child, you have to get them to agree with the rules and participate. And remember, what you're trying to cultivate is self-control. So you don't wait till there's a problem. When the child shows good self-control, like again with our child, Diane would see something would happen, she didn't get what she wanted or whatever, but she managed not to throw a tantrum or not to be upset. And, well, that was good that you showed control, and praise them for showing self-control there. As I said, there a lot of other things in the book, but again, making that a priority and realizing that's the goal. Watching other parents, it's just horrifying to see the kid says, I want to go this, and the parent says, no, we can't go this. I want to go this. And finally the kid throws a tantrum and the parent gives in. And you say, oh, Jesus, you're just training your kid to lose control. Instead, if you're about to give the child something and then it does something, it throws a tantrum or something, you say, well, then I was going to give it to you, but I can't give it to you now because you misbehaved. Making sure, insist on showing that control and respect and following rules, and then rewarding that very well, that produces a very nice positive...
and the biggest thing really is consistency. I mean, as far as giving punishments and rewards, they don't have to be strict punishment. I mean, there isn't, but it should be done quickly and consistently. And one of the reasons that successful parents have successful children, there's such a high correlation. There's probably genetic factors, but it's also that those parents have self-control themselves, and it takes self-control to instill it in a child. It's much easier to let them get away with it, to just clean up the mess instead of making them do it. And in the book we have Nanny Deb from Nanny 911. We talked to her and how she does it, and they have these rules, and it works very well. It's sort of that Victorian idea of how people do it, and it's one reason. We also talk about how this correlation that's been found between single-parent households, children in those tend to do less well, and there could be genetic reasons, there could be various reasons for it. But one is it really takes, there's one less person to exert self-control. The single parent is basically just trying to hold things together, whereas when there's two, you can double team the reinforcement. So
I'm having trouble thinking about how to constantly monitor self-control with your kids, but also deal with the fatigue issue that you talked about earlier. I have an elementary school and a preschool child, and I'm told by the teachers they're angels all day and exert wonderful self-control, but when they get home, they're just, no matter whether I give them a snack or don't give them a snack, they seem to just have a meltdown between the hours of 5 and 7.
Well, we all do, don't we?
Yeah. I want to.
That's happy hour.
I did this.
I'm supposed to control to help manage them. So I guess the question is should we recognize the fatigue and give them a little bit of a breather because they are children and they've been good all day long, or is that giving in and actually going to create a cycle of them not exerting self-control? I struggle with how strict to be during that witching hours.
I think giving them a snack is a great start. I mean, one of the rules is just eat first and things. Don't make empty. And I think also just try to don't schedule really difficult things to do. I mean, I wrote the New York Times Magazine excerpted our chapter on decision fatigue in the magazine, and I went up there and I was talking to them, and they said, we've stopped scheduling meetings after 4 o'clock now. After reading this stuff, it just seemed like that's not the time of day to try and make big decisions and do difficult things. So I'm with my son. I was very just let him come and watch TV or play a video game when he gets home. He's exhausted from school. Let him just chill and give him some food and let him relax.
And probably not sugar, because that the glycemic index thing gives an up and a crash. Healthier food would probably produce a more stable pattern of glucose and energy. Yes?
You talk about how willpower relates to decision making. How does decision making from the gut come into play, if at all?
Okay, decision making from the gut, that tends to be what people do when their willpower is depleted. They'll make more impulsive, hence more sometimes bad decisions. We don't know all the parts yet, but first of all, the rational thinking through being disciplined, that's what takes willpower, and also making that commitment, sort of stamping it in. I think of it as the writing to disk phase that uses a lot of energy. That also takes some of it. I should say too, we showed that making decisions depletes self-control, but after exerting self-control, it changes decision-making too. And we published some studies on that people, for example, a compromise, when people are in full possession of their power, they are compromisers, and they'll do a little bit of this or work things together or trade off price and quality to get just the right mix. When they're depleted from acts of self-control, they're just give me the cheapest or give me the best or something. The compromise goes out the window. more irrational bias, making decisions based on things that shouldn't have anything to do with the decision, more postponing the decision, and just I'm not going to pick anything. So decision making is degraded in various ways too when willpower is depleted.
There's like a term like analysis paralysis. You spend too much time trying to come up with a decision that maybe.
Well, there's a great example we have in the book of this actor Jim Turner, who was an Arliss, and he suffers from diabetes, and he has a one-man show about it, and that shows you some of these symptoms of what happens when your glucose is low. It's an extreme case, and he was having a crash on the beach with his son, and he realized he had to get some food into him, and they got up and they left the beach, and they were at the concession area, and he had to go to the bathroom, and he had to eat, and he was so depleted. He just stood there for 20 minutes. He couldn't make the decision. He just sat down. His son was freaking out. He couldn't make the decision. He said it's like your brain has suddenly, there's a piece of your brain missing. And that's what that paralysis is. You just don't have the energy to make a decision at that point.
You probably could have had them both done in the 20 minutes he was waiting to decide which one to do first.
A corollary question to the fatigue question. If I'm hearing correctly, you're saying self-control like a muscle. When you exert it, you actually get better at it.
Yeah, the short-term effect is to get worse, but the long-term is to get better.
That only happens after, initially you're tired, so you only get better at it after you have a rest cycle.
Right, correct.
So what if, and I see this both at work and in coaching people athletically, what if the lack of self-control is in the rest cycle? Like people, when they get tired, what they do is they go harder, they go more, and they rest less. And that's just a vicious cycle. How do you talk about that in the book, about how to get more self-control over resting versus doing more?
Well, we do talk about, there's a tendency that it takes self-control actually to enjoy yourselves too. And there are people that, that there are kind of extreme tightwads and extreme spendthrifts who neither one of them, or they're both kind of irrational about these things. And people who don't, and it does take some willpower and self-control to set aside time to enjoy things. That you've got to use that. You've got to, don't just work all the time. You've got to make the effort to plan a vacation and set time aside and make a decision. I'm not going to do any more work in this time, and I've done enough. And it's what's so hard about ego depletion is that you don't really recognize how bad you've become. Like this wrestler may not realize I'm too tired. I'm just working harder, and I need to rest some. And just recognizing that there's one source of energy for all these different things. You can't just power through everything. You can't just say, I'll get by in 4 hours sleep and keep doing it and do 10 different things. You've got to recognize, I've got a finite supply, so I'll do this, but I'm not going to do that.
There's some experiments we published earlier this year showed an instance of that where we had assigned people to be in a leadership role in a group. Actually, it was all just made up. We told them they were doing the same thing. Either they were assigned to be, we told them they're the leader or they're the subordinate, the follower. And the subordinates showed the usual pattern. When they were depleted, their performance went down. The ones who were told they were the boss, they kept going at a high level. And in fact, sometimes if the task had been something that leaders normally would delegate to someone else, they tended not to do it, but when they were depleted, then they even did those tasks as well. So they seem to be less judicious in managing their energies, which seems to be exactly what you're suggesting. So their performance continued at a high level, but then when we tested them afterwards, they were really wasted. So I'm not knowing exactly what the cure is for it, but this pattern is very real. That sometimes making the decision about how to manage your energies, that is actually degraded when you have less energy to use in things and you use it inefficiently.
Let's just do one more question.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll do two more. Okay.
In the book you mentioned these studies about distal and proximal goals.
Mm-hmm.
And there seems to be a discrepancy between the students that have like distal goals that actually don't meet them in contrast with the proximal goals. How is this reconciled?
I don't understand.
Well, there were a couple studies. We mentioned a couple studies in which some students did better by having very short-term goals, and some by having a monthly goal.
Yeah.
And we talk about that. You can't make an overarching generalization about it, because in some cases you're better off doing one. I think one was that older students tend to do better, right? Was that right?
Well, ultimately to be effective, you need both. If you have too many detailed goals, then you end up you're not flexible. So there has to be some degree of flexibility in the timetable and so forth. Especially as you pointed out, most people don't meet their targets day by day. But still, if you mainly set short-term goals, then you just life goes by. Well, where did it all go? You don't really get to anywhere. You just deal with things one at a time. So that's not effective. If you just set long-term goals, you don't know how to get there, and it's sort of frustrating and daunting, and you sort of flail around and don't get there either. You need to have the long-term goal and then elaborate it onto what are the short-term goals needed to make progress toward it. I tell the students I advise and so on, you should have a 5-year plan. You can change it, but what you're doing now, you should have an idea of where you want to be in 5 years, and then you should also translate into the what should I be doing now in order to get there. They start graduate school, well, I want to have a PhD in 5 years. Well, that means you have to get this much done and get this many publications, which that means you better get started and have this much done this month or this semester. And that getting both of those is really the only effective way to get where you want to be in life. Okay,
there was one here that you'd accept. You
have time. I was just wondering what you think of. Are there cases where it is better to act on impulse? Like, are you wasting? If you talk about outsourcing as an efficient way to preserve self-control, isn't it also saying, well, some impulses are okay? I mean, in some cases, like in combat, you need to act on impulse, and in other cases, like when deciding what color of shoes do I want to wear today or something like that, I mean, if I act on impulse, then I'm saving.
Well, yes. I mean, impulses make life fun, and I think if you have good self-control, then your impulses won't carry you away into trouble, and you sort of know when you can let your guard down and act on impulse, and I think that's appropriate. So, yes, we're not at all advocating a life that's totally planned and budgeted, but if you manage the big things, then you can go out and impulse purchase or eat what you want or do kinky things with your spouse or whatever. So yeah, you make some space for enjoying your impulses as well. Impulsive styles of work generally don't work as well as effective ones. I know people who've studied college professors. Some write very steadily and plod along and write a couple of pages every day, and others will stay up all night and work for 2 weeks really intensely writing a paper and then not write anything for a month and so on. And well, the ones that get tenure are the first ones who keep producing at a steady rate. The so-called binge writers. That's not an effective way to do it. But as long as you keep producing and manage the big things effectively, then sure, you can make room in your life for impulsive stuff, and that will enrich life.
Like impulse purchases of, say, a book.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.